The wind on the North Ridge had a different voice. It was not the conversational whisper of the valley, but the low, steady threat of a predator. November of 1888 was preparing to be a cruel one. Amelia Thorne felt the promise of it in her bones, a deep ache that resonated with the frozen mud seeping through the worn soles of her shoes. In her right hand, she clutched a single flour sack, its contents a paltry summary of a life, 2 books with cracked spines, a handful of dried beans that rattled like stones, and a small, precious tin of matches. Her daughter, Lily, 7 years old and silent, had a fistful of Amelia's worn wool skirt, her knuckles white. Beside them, their dog, a German shepherd named Baron, stood with his shoulders tensed, a growl vibrating in his chest so low it was more a feeling than a sound. The man from the town council, Mr. Harris, did not look at her. He looked past her, at the grey, unforgiving face of the mountain. He cleared his throat, a dry, official sound. "The deed is for the limestone cave on the North Ridge," he said, the words carried away by the wind almost as soon as they were spoken. "It's more than you deserve, but the town is charitable." He handed her a rusted key, heavy and cold in her palm. A key to a cave. But he did not know, and she could not have guessed, that the true value of that cave was not the shelter it offered, but the warm, damp air that rose from a crack in its floor. It was a secret the earth kept, waiting for someone who knew how to listen. Tell us in the comments, where in the world are you watching from tonight? Amelia had always been a listener, but not to the things the town of Redemption valued. She listened to the earth. Her late husband, Robert, had not been a farmer, but a geologist, a man who saw stories in strata and futures in fault lines. He had died 2 years prior in a mine collapse, leaving her with a daughter, a dog, a small, mortgaged cabin, and a shelf of books that the townspeople found strange and unsettling. While other women quilted and gossiped, Amelia read. She studied Robert's texts on soil composition, hydrology, and thermal gradients. She learned that limestone was porous, that water moved through it in secret ways, and that the heat of the planet's core sometimes found its way to the surface in unexpected places. This knowledge made people uncomfortable. When she suggested to a neighboring farmer that rotating his crops might improve his failing yield, he had looked at her as if she'd uttered a blasphemy. When she asked Mr. Harris at the general store why they didn't dig the town well deeper to tap the lower aquifer she was certain existed, he had patted her on the shoulder and told her not to trouble her pretty head with such matters. She was a woman, and a widow at that. She existed in a social category that had room for piety, grief, and quiet domesticity, but not for geological certainty. Her intelligence was an inconvenience, a disruption to the established order of things. The world she lived in had no place for a woman who knew the earth better than the men who claimed to own it. The rejection was never a single, violent act. It was a slow, systemic erosion. It was the averted eyes at the Sunday service. It was the way men stopped speaking when she approached a group. It was the whispers that followed her from the mercantile. The preacher's wife, Mrs. Gable, had given voice to the town's verdict one afternoon after a church social. "A woman's hands are for the hearth and the cradle," she'd said to a circle of nodding women, loud enough for Amelia to hear. "Not for scratching in the dirt like a man. It's unnatural. Unnatural." That was the word they used for her competence. It was unnatural for her to understand why one field lay fallow while another thrived. It was unnatural for her to prefer the company of books to the prospect of a new husband. Her independence was not seen as strength, but as a perversion of the proper order. A woman alone was a problem to be solved, usually through marriage. A woman who seemed to have no interest in that solution was a threat. The end came quietly, on a Tuesday. The credit Robert had established at the general store, the same one owned by Mr. Harris, had run out. There was no work for a woman who could read rock but not a ledger, or so they told her. The foreclosure was legal. It was orderly. It was done, they assured her, for her own good. The town council met, and in their bureaucratic wisdom, they decided that sending her and the child to a poorhouse in a larger city would be an expense. It was far cheaper, and far cleaner, to give her something worthless that belonged to the town anyway. The old cave on the North Ridge, a place children dared each other to enter and where no animal would willingly shelter, was deemed a suitable act of charity. They were not casting her out, they told themselves. They were relocating her. They were washing their hands of a problem that had too many sharp edges. And so she stood on that ridge, the deed in one hand and a key in the other, facing a future as cold and hard as the stone before her. The mouth of the cave was a dark, jagged wound in the hillside. Inside, the air was still and smelled of damp stone and a deep, ancient cold. It was not a home. It was a tomb in waiting. The first week was a blur of shivering. Amelia, Lily, and Baron huddled together under a single, threadbare quilt, a small island of warmth in an ocean of cold. The dog's body heat was a furnace, a steady, living comfort against the creeping chill that seemed to radiate from the very rock itself. Sleep did not come in long stretches, but in short, frantic bursts, punctuated by the chattering of Lily's teeth or the low whine of the dog. Amelia would lie awake for hours, listening to the silence, a profound and heavy thing that was far more menacing than the wind outside. The physical suffering was precise. Her fingers, raw from gathering scarce, damp wood, would burn with a fierce, angry pain as she coaxed a sputtering fire to life, then go numb, a terrifying absence of feeling that made her fear she would lose them. The constant shivering worked its way into her jaw, making her teeth ache with a deep, percussive rhythm. At times, the hunger was so profound it made her dizzy, the cave walls seeming to tilt and swim before her eyes. On those days, she would crawl to the back of the cave, to a slow, steady seep of water that tasted of iron and stone, and drink until the dizziness subsided. She counted the beans. Each one was a promise of another few hours of life. She would boil a dozen at a time in the small tin pot she'd carried, creating a thin, watery broth that was more hope than sustenance. She watched Lily eat, her own stomach a tight, aching knot. She grew thin, then gaunt. The cold was a thief, stealing the very flesh from her bones. One night, the temperature dropped so far that her breath plumed in the air even under the quilt. The fire was down to a few sullen embers she couldn't afford to feed until morning. Lily was asleep, but her small body trembled with a violence that terrified Amelia. In the oppressive dark, Amelia considered failure. She imagined walking back down the mountain, knocking on the door of the church rectory, and begging. Begging for a corner in the basement, for a bowl of the thin, warm oatmeal she had once so disdained at the church socials. She thought of the smug, pitying look on Mrs. Gable's face, the quiet triumph in Mr. Harris's eyes. The thought was a lash of humiliation. But then she looked at Lily, whose face in the faint moonlight was pale and small, and she wondered if her pride was worth more than her daughter's life. She lay in the dark and considered whether this was it. This was the end of their story, a quiet, cold surrender in a forgotten hole in the ground. What pulled her back was not a prayer or a sudden surge of hope. It was the dog. Baron, sensing her despair, pushed his cold nose into her hand and whined, a soft, insistent sound. He needed to be let out. It was a simple, non-negotiable demand of life. A body needed to move. A creature needed care. That small, practical problem was an anchor in the swirling chaos of her thoughts. She got up, her joints cracking in protest. As she pushed aside the heavy animal hide she'd hung over the entrance, the biting air hit her. And with it, a sentence surfaced from the depths of her memory, a line from one of Robert's geology books. Where limestone meets water, the earth breathes. She had water. A slow seep, but it was constant. She had limestone. The entire mountain was made of it. The earth breathes. The phrase echoed in her mind. It was not poetry. It was a statement of fact. Her husband had underlined it. Instead of going back to the miserable warmth of the quilt, she took a lit branch from the embers and walked toward the back of the cave, deeper into the darkness than she had yet dared to go. The air grew colder, the dampness more pronounced. She followed the slick trail of moisture on the rock wall until it disappeared behind a jumble of fallen rock. It seemed like a dead end. Disappointment, cold and familiar, settled in her chest. But Baron, who had followed her, began sniffing intently at the base of the rockfall, his tail giving a single, tentative wag. He looked back at her, then back at the rocks, and whined again. She knelt, holding the torch low. And then she felt it. It was not a blast of heat, but a subtle, almost imperceptible shift in the air around her ankles. A current of air that did not carry the sharp, crystalline bite of the outside world. It was gentle. Pushing aside a smaller rock, she found the source. A narrow fissure, no wider than her hand, snaked down into the darkness. From it rose a steady, silent breath of air. It was moist. And it was warm. Not hot, but a constant, unwavering warmth, like a living thing exhaling from the deep. Geothermal heat. The planet's own furnace, venting through a crack in its stone skin. Amelia placed her numb hand over the opening. The air that flowed over her palm was a miracle of physics. It felt like 55 degrees. Maybe 60. A temperature that could sustain life. A temperature that could defy winter. She did not cry. Relief was too small a word for what she felt. She sat down on the cold, hard floor of the cave, the torchlight flickering on her face, and felt something she had no name for except right. It was recognition. The land had not abandoned her. It had held this secret, this gift, waiting for someone with the knowledge to receive it. People had given her a key to a cold stone box. The earth had given her a hearth. The discovery of the warm fissure changed everything. It was no longer a question of mere survival, but of engineering. The first task was to capture the warmth. Amelia spent 3 days moving the fallen rocks, her muscles screaming in protest, until she had cleared a small space around the fissure. Then, using the largest, flattest stone she could carry, she began to build a wall. It was slow, agonizing work. She used mud from the damp floor, mixed with dried grass and pine needles, as a rough mortar to fill the gaps. The wall was ugly and uneven, but it was functional. It enclosed a small area at the back of the cave, creating a room within a room, a sanctuary that trapped the steady, rising warmth. The temperature inside this new chamber was transformative. It was a haven from the biting cold of the main cave. Here, they could sleep without shivering, their breath no longer fogging in the air. It was here, in this small pocket of terrestrial grace, that Amelia decided to make her stand against the winter. She had a handful of seeds, saved from her garden at the cabin, wrapped in a piece of cloth at the bottom of the flour sack. It was a pathetic arsenal, some hardy lettuce, a dozen radish seeds, and 5 precious, paper-thin tomato seeds from a packet tucked inside one of Robert's books. To plant them outside was impossible. But in here? In this warm, humid, subterranean world. She needed soil. For 2 weeks, she used the empty flour sack to haul dirt from a sheltered patch of forest floor she'd found under a thicket of pines. Each trip was a battle against the wind and the deepening snow, but she returned each time with another precious load of dark, rich earth. She spread it carefully in a shallow bed she built up against the back wall of the warm chamber, a small plot of land no bigger than a tabletop. She needed light. The dim, smoky fire near the cave's entrance was not enough. She remembered a passage in a book about Arctic explorers. She took the small bit of salt pork Jedediah had left and painstakingly rendered the fat in her tin pot over the fire. She tore a strip from the hem of her last petticoat, soaked it in the warm fat, and placed it in a small, hollowed-out stone. The result was a crude lamp, but it gave off a steady, if faint, light. It was enough. With Lily holding the stone lamp, Amelia pushed the seeds into the cool, dark soil. It felt like an act of absurd, impossible faith. Planting a garden in the dead of winter, underground. But her knowledge told her it was possible. The air was warm. The humidity was high from the fissure and the water seep. The only missing ingredient was sun, and for that, the little fat lamp would have to do for a few hours each day. While they waited for the seeds to sprout, life took on a new rhythm. Amelia, taught by Jedediah's brief visit, became a more effective hunter. She built deadfall traps and snares along game trails, and soon they had a steady supply of rabbit and squirrel. Baron, with his keen nose, would often lead her to the day's catch. Jedediah himself became a sporadic but welcome presence. He was a man of few words, but his actions spoke volumes. He never asked about the garden, but one day he arrived with a cracked but usable cast iron pot he'd salvaged from an abandoned trapper's cabin. Another time, he left a small sack of cornmeal and a block of salt. He never stayed long, but his visits were a reminder that they were not entirely alone in the world. He saw what she was building not as an oddity, but as a logical solution to a set of problems. He respected her competence, and in his quiet way, he became her first and only ally. Then, one morning in late January, Lily let out a small gasp. In the garden bed, two tiny, pale green leaves had pushed their way through the soil. Amelia knelt, her heart pounding. It was life. Defiant and impossible. Over the next few weeks, more green appeared. The radishes came up first, their leaves sharp and peppery. Then the lettuce, forming small, tight rosettes of a pale, delicate green. The tomato plants were spindly and weak, but they were growing. The first harvest was a ceremony. Amelia pulled a single, perfect head of lettuce from the soil. The leaves were crisp and cool. She washed it in the clean, cold water from the seep and handed a leaf to Lily. The sound of her daughter crunching into the fresh green echoed in the quiet of the cave. It was the sound of victory. It was more than food. It was proof. Proof that her knowledge was not useless. Proof that what the world had dismissed as unnatural was, in fact, the very engine of their survival. The community's conversion began not with an apology, but with a radish. Jedediah, on a rare trip to town for ammunition and coffee, found himself short on coin. He walked into Harris's mercantile and, without a word, placed 5 perfectly formed, crimson radishes on the counter. Harris stared at them. It was February. The ground outside was frozen 3 feet deep. Fresh produce was a memory. "Where did you get these?" Harris asked, his voice a mixture of suspicion and awe. Jedediah just grunted. Good soil. He took his coffee and left. The story of the radishes spread through the town like a winter fever. It was whispered about over fences and in the pews of the church. The preacher, Reverend Gable, warned his flock from the pulpit about unnatural things grown in darkness. His words a clear, if veiled, accusation aimed at the woman on the mountain. He spoke of temptation and things that defied God's seasons, his fear masquerading as piety. Some listened. But hunger is a more compelling sermon than fear. A deep, hacking cough began to circulate through Redemption, a sickness that settled in the lungs and did not leave. The town's meager stores of preserved vegetables were running low. There was no fresh food, nothing with the life of the sun in it. One afternoon, a young mother named Sarah, whose son was wasting away from the fever, made a desperate choice. She bundled herself against the cold and made the long, arduous trek up the north ridge to the cave. She found Amelia not huddled in rags, but cleaning a rabbit, a small, steady fire burning near the entrance. The woman was thin, but her eyes were clear and her movements were efficient. Sarah, stammering, explained about her son. She didn't know what she was asking for. Medicine? A miracle. Amelia listened without interruption. When Sarah was finished, she simply nodded, went into the warm inner chamber, and returned with a handful of fresh lettuce and some pungent herbs she'd found growing near the fissure. "Boil these in a broth," she said. "It will help." She asked for nothing in return. Sarah's son recovered. The story of that recovery did what the radishes could not. It chipped away at the town's fear. A week later, another family appeared at the mouth of the cave. This time, they did not come empty-handed. They left a small sack of flour and a dozen precious eggs. Amelia accepted them with a quiet nod and gave them a basket of greens. A new economy was born, one based not on credit or coin, but on need and production. They came for what she grew, not for her. They did not offer friendship or apologies. They offered barter. And for Amelia, that was more than enough. It was a form of respect she had never been granted in the valley below. She was no longer a burden. She was a resource. That year, the snows began in early October and did not stop. Old-timers who had lived in the valley for 50 years said they had never seen anything like it. Storm after storm rolled in from the north, burying the world in a sea of white. By mid-February, the town of Redemption was entombed. 8 feet of snow lay in the valley, with drifts burying cabins up to their roof lines. The single road that connected them to the outside world was impassable. They were completely, utterly cut off. The town's carefully preserved stores, meant to last a normal winter, began to dwindle at an alarming rate. The sickness from the previous year returned, but this time it was complicated by malnutrition. Children grew listless. The old grew frail. The quiet desperation of the previous winter had become a loud, public panic. The food was running out. One morning, a delegation of 4 men appeared at Amelia's cave. They had struggled for hours through the chest-deep snow, their faces raw from the wind. Leading them was Mr. Harris. He looked nothing like the proud, officious man who had banished her months before. He was gaunt, his fine wool coat replaced by a patchwork of rough hides. The certainty had gone out of his eyes, replaced by a weary, desperate exhaustion. He looked smaller than she remembered, diminished by the cold and the weight of his responsibility. He looked like a man who had not been warm in a very long time. They did not ask for forgiveness. They did not speak of the past. Harris, his voice hoarse, stated their purpose with the bluntness of a man who had no time for pretense. The town was starving. They had maybe a week of food left. They needed what she had. Amelia looked at the 4 shivering men, their breath pluming in the frigid air. She saw not the councilmen and merchants who had cast her out, but simply hungry people. She turned to Lily, who was now a strong, capable girl of 8. "Lily," she said, her voice calm and even. "Put more wood on the fire. These men are cold." Then she turned back to Harris. Her response was not emotional. It was logistical. "How many families are there?" she asked. "How much can you carry back each trip?" There was no gloating. There was no demand for an apology. Her mind was already working on the problem, the rationing, the transport, the needs of the weakest. The power dynamic had completely inverted, and she did not acknowledge it with so much as a word. Her quiet competence was its own statement, more powerful than any accusation she could have leveled. For the next 2 hours, they worked. Amelia led the men into the warm, green-scented inner chamber. They stared in stunned silence at the rows of thriving plants, at the baskets of potatoes, carrots, and turnips she had managed to grow and store in the cave's steady, cool temperature. It was a miracle born not of divinity, but of knowledge and relentless effort. They loaded sacks with food, their movements clumsy with cold and awe. As they prepared to leave, their shoulders stooped with the weight of the life-saving provisions, Harris stepped toward Amelia. He reached inside his coat and pulled out a folded, yellowed piece of paper. He pressed it into her hand. It was the original deed to her old cabin in the valley. He did not make a speech. He could not meet her eyes. He just looked at the heavy sack at his feet and said, this was a mistake. It was not a full apology. It was not a confession of his cruelty or the town's prejudice. But it was an admission. It was a relinquishing of power. It had cost him his pride, and in that world, a man's pride was a currency more valuable than gold. Amelia looked at the paper in her hand, then back at the sacks of food. She gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. "Paper won't keep them warm," she said, her voice devoid of any triumph. "Take the extra blankets by the wall." She never moved back to the cabin. The cave was her home. Over the years, she and Jedediah expanded it, building stone walls and a proper door. She terraced the hillside outside, and in the summer, it bloomed with a riot of vegetables. But the winter garden, deep in the warm breath of the earth, was always her sanctuary. She taught anyone who came to her with a genuine desire to learn. She showed them how to read the land, how to find the north-facing hills where the earth's warmth was closest to the surface, how to build their own small thermal-assisted greenhouses. She gave her knowledge away as freely as she had once given her food. Decades passed. Amelia Thorne grew old. She died on a bright spring morning in her 90th year, sitting in a sturdy wooden chair Jedediah had built for her just inside the mouth of the cave. The sun was warm on her face. A cup of mint tea, grown from a plant whose ancestor she had first planted in the dark, was still warm on the table beside her. In her lap rested a small, worn, leather-bound book of geological surveys. From deeper in the cave, she could hear the sound of her great-granddaughter singing softly as she watered the neat rows of January tomatoes. The work, her true legacy, continued. Over the course of her long life, her methods had fed hundreds of people through 7 particularly hard winters. She had trained more than 24 families in the art of subterranean agriculture, creating a resilient community that no longer feared the snow. Her headstone was a simple, flat rock that Jedediah, himself an old man, placed at the entrance to the cave. He carved a single sentence into it with the tip of his knife, Amelia Thorne. She made the earth breathe. The world will often give you a key to a place it considers worthless. A cave. A dismissal. A sealed door. It will tell you that this is all you deserve. Perhaps you have been standing outside a door like that for a long time, told there is nothing inside but darkness and cold. But what if the cold is just the first room? What if, deeper inside, the earth has been breathing all this time, waiting for you to feel its warmth? What gift has the world dismissed in you, and when will you finally step inside to claim it? That rusted key never opened a lock. It opened a world. The world mistakes charity for justice, but the land always remembers the difference. We tell stories about the quiet architects of survival. If you believe resilience is built, not given, subscribe for more stories from the forgotten corners of history.